reside in the homelands of Indigenous people is an important step in recognizing the history and the original stewards of this land. Land acknowledgements must extend far beyond words. The United States has worked hard to erase the narratives of Indigenous peoples over time. Land acknowledgement statements can help to remind us of the history, the contributions, and the sacrifices of Native peoples have made. We honor and acknowledge that we are in the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. This area in particular in Auraria campus, specifically the confluence of the Platte and Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 Indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, Paiute, Zuni, Hopi, among others. We must recognize Indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants, stewards, and relatives of this land. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, remember the ties that these nations still have to their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and pay our respects to the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Let us all give thanks to all the tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. And I want to acknowledge that Gracie Redshirt Tyon is the one who drafted this land acknowledgement, and for her leadership in making this a ceremonial statement that we say at all our events. So thank you, Gracie, although she couldn't join us. I wanted to share a little bit about our Food for Thought speaker series. This is an event sponsored by the Asian American Student Services to really elevate awareness about the contemporary issues that impact the Asian American and other minoritized communities, as well as remembering the history that often teaches us lessons for the future. And so today we have a very special guest, a colleague who works at CU Boulder, Dr. Ming Chen. She's an associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder Law School and the faculty director of the Immigration and Citizenship Law Program. She holds faculty affiliations in political science and ethnic studies. Professor Chen brings an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of immigration, civil rights, and the administrative state. Professor Chen sits on the Colorado Advisory Council to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and she serves as a co-editor for the Immigration Prof blog, Improv. Prior to joining the Legal Academy, Professor Chen clerked for the Honorable James R. Browning on the U.S. Court of Appeals, Ninth Circuit in San Francisco. She also worked for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, National Asian Pacific American Legal Consortium, and the Brookings Institution. She earned degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, PhD in 2011, New York University Law School, her JD in 2004, and Harvard College, AB 2000. Her new book, Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, is the basis for today's talk, and she'll be open to taking some questions. And if we have time, she'll talk about some of the broader immigration policies that have passed and the implication for the Asian American community, as well as all minoritized groups. So we're really pleased to have Dr. Chen here to share her expertise and especially her research that she has done for her new book. So thank you all for joining us. And please feel free to put in any questions in the chat box. Sung and I will help monitor it, and we'll definitely allow some time for Q&A. But if you have a burning question, don't, if it's okay, we can go ahead and feel free to interject. So without further ado, Dr. Chen, take it away. And Sung, if you could help us record, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Soyan, for the chance to talk with a sister campus at CU Denver. I'm really happy to be able to talk with you both about my book, which just came out a month ago, but also about the implications of that book for the 2020 election, which of course is just a few weeks away. So let me start with this sentence. In any given year, only about half of immigrants who are eligible for citizenship pursue it. And yet over the last 3 years, interest has risen by 10%. This leads me to the question of why immigrants pursue citizenship, why they're pursuing it now, and what does it mean for the 2020 election. Now, in terms of motivation, as Soyan mentioned, I teach at the University of Colorado in the law school, and several times a year I bring law students to naturalization workshops where we assist green card holders with their application for citizenship. And I remember distinctly in the fall of 2016, we were volunteering at a high school in Aurora, and we noticed that these lines for citizenship were getting longer and longer. And that's really what made us wonder why so many immigrants were interested in pursuing citizenship. And, you know, the naturalization application form is about 20 pages long. It asks you about your background, how long you've been in the United States, how much you've traveled down to the days, and needing to add them up to make sure that you haven't been outside of the country for too long. But one question that is not asked on that form is the one that's on this slide. Why are you interested in being an immigrant? And given that so many of the people you meet at these naturalization workshops have actually been eligible for citizenship for 10, 15, or 20 years, why are you interested now? Now, many of the, that's the question I want to take up today, and I'll tell you the punchline. Many of the immigrants that we met said that they wanted to become citizens because they could no longer afford not to be citizens. And that it will give us a sense both of their experiences, but also the climate that we're all in right now. So this is an outline of the book, and essentially I'll present it in 3 pieces. First, a little bit of a discussion of what's wrong that's led to the kind of citizenship insecurity that I discovered at these naturalization workshops. Second, I'll give you just a couple of the 100 stories of immigrants that I found in interviewing people here in Colorado. They were grouped in 6 different legal categories, but I'm just going to highlight a few of them that are particularly well represented in the Asian American community. And then I'm going to end a little bit by talking about immigration policies, as I said, both how we can move forward and what some of the challenges might be. So that'll be the roadmap for our presentation. So let's talk first about how we got here. I think there's a really common understanding of immigration law as being a binary. You're either an immigrant or you're a citizen, and you're legal or you're illegal. And that makes you either an insider or an outsider. And usually that dividing line between insiders and outsiders is considered to be the border. I think that common understanding is not necessarily wrong, but I think it is incomplete. And so my book takes a broader view of citizenship in 2 different ways. First, instead of thinking about citizenship as a binary, I think about there being a spectrum of citizenship. Immigrants enter the country in many different ways, and over time, some become US citizens and some do not. In fact, some never have that. Enter the United States on a visa that can lead automatically to a green card. And after waiting a certain amount of time and assuming they maintain eligibility, they are allowed to go on to formal citizenship. So that's one path, and that represents about 2/3 of the interviews I conducted. There are also immigrants who come on these more limited paths. You might think, for example, about international students who come traditionally on an F visa, which is time limited to their period of study. And while there is the possibility of going on to a green card and US citizenship, that is not automatically provided for. They would actually need to change their visa status to be able to continue on this path. And while I'm not going to focus on it today, of course, there are immigrants who arrive in the United States without documents or who overstay their visa and are undocumented immigrants. And the lucky among them may receive something like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival status, or DACA. But otherwise, those immigrants are largely out of luck when it comes to having a pathway to citizenship. Now, the second way that I think the binary view of citizenship is incomplete is that it focuses just on legal status. That's essentially the law school definition of immigration, and it might seem odd for me as an immigration law professor to stretch beyond the law. But as I talk to real people about their lives, what I realized is that not only was there the spectrum of formal citizenship that I've just told you about, there's also an aspect of substantive citizenship that includes social, legal, economic, and political belonging. And ultimately what I found during these interviews is that those experiences of whether you feel like you belong, whether you feel like you have a good job, and whether you feel like your voice matters are all part of what makes you a full citizen in the United States. So in a nutshell, that's the theory in the book. And I want to round it out now by giving you some snapshots of conversations that I had with these immigrants. Now, as I mentioned, in total, there were about 100 immigrants in the interview sample, and they occupied 6 different legal categories. They were from different countries, they were from different races, they speak different languages. They were all living very different lives here in Colorado. Roughly, I organized the immigrants into these 4 categories. It's simpler than it may look. Essentially, I looked at their formal legal status, and then also these different aspects of substantive citizenship, their economic and social belonging, for example. And I just considered whether they were high or low on those different dimensions. And box 1 essentially is those who are high in both statuses, maybe some of the green card holders that I'm going to tell you about. If you can imagine, up here in this corner might be US citizens who were born in the United States. They weren't actually part of my interview, but so that you can see how that spectrum would extend. Down here, the other extreme would be those who have low formal citizenship, perhaps those who are on a temporary visa or those who are undocumented. And who also have low substantive citizenship, for example, those who feel that they have to live their life in the shadows or in a sense of constant uncertainty. So of the green card holders, I think I'll focus today on those who had family-sponsored or employment-sponsored green cards, and also just a little bit about refugees, including some refugees that I met through APDC, who are of Burmese background. So this poster is from one of those naturalization workshops that I told you about that I go to several times a year with my students. And as I mentioned, many of the immigrants at these naturalization workshops were Latino. So let me start there. This is a picture of Salvador. He himself is an immigrant from Mexico who came to the United States as a teenager. He now works with a community organization called Mi Familia Vota, which organizes many of these workshops and also registers voters to participate in the election. So he described his own story and those of the immigrants he serves as a story of wanting to have a say in their lives, especially during these times that seem so dark and scary. As one example, he introduced me to a woman named Luz, who said, having papers really helps when you're dealing with law enforcement. Without them, you were mute. She described feeling that moving from a green card to citizenship would be an insurance policy against these negative encounters in the community and against the possibility of continually changing immigration laws. She cited, for example, the example of the Muslim travel ban in 2017. But keep in mind, she and many of the other immigrants that I met are Latino, they're not Muslim, and they're green card holders. They're not at immediate or direct risk of being deported or excluded from the United States by these travel bans. The idea was that they were aware of these policies and felt that if they weren't directly affected by this policy, they were never sure what was going to come next, and they might be affected by the next one. Now, in contrast to this experience, I wanted to also introduce this gentleman. His name is Bob Marshall. He's a scientist and also a faculty member at CU Boulder. Now, he is also a green card holder, but as you can see, he is white and male. He's from Canada. He came to the United States about 20 years ago for college, initially as an international student. He stayed on for graduate school, went on to a postdoc, and then eventually became a green card holder through marriage, although he certainly had avenues through work as well. Now, when I met him, he had not actually applied for citizenship. We were having coffee on campus in Boulder, but he told me that he had actually filled out that N-400, that application for citizenship, and he was actively deciding after 20 years whether he should file because also of the travel ban. Now, remember, he is also not subject to that travel ban. He's not Muslim. He's not from one of the Muslim majority countries that were named in that travel ban. But nonetheless, even for him, it served as a wake-up call to the fact that while having a green card might previously have seemed like enough, it no longer felt like enough. So this was a variation on a theme for the other green card holders. There were refugees as well, which is a group that is a little bit different because unlike the 50% or so, or now the 60% or so of immigrants who go on to naturalize, almost every refugee goes on to naturalize. And I met a woman named Mary through APDC who herself is Burmese. And she told me that she was very grateful to be in the United States, to have the chance to be safe and to have that opportunity to naturalize. And yet she said that she would always be a refugee. She would never see herself as American because socially and substantively, she still felt very far outside the United States. So I think these stories that you're hearing about Latino green card holders, about refugees, and even to some extent, white Canadian tech workers, is one that shows these patterns. It shows a pattern of people wanting to become citizenship for reasons that are a little darker than we might imagine when you think about patriotic music and American pie and American flags. A lot of the motivations that I saw were about feeling the need to become a citizen so that you wouldn't lose public benefits, as has become the case with the public charge rule that recently went into effect. It was about wanting to participate in the election so that you could vote against a particular candidate or to vote against a particular policy that you might find damaging to your community. It was also essentially about wanting to see citizenship as a strategy for inclusion. And this is what I call defensive citizenship in the book. So moving from the why to the how, what I found in these variety of interviews essentially is that there was this sense of citizenship insecurity, even among the more privileged, or at least the more legally privileged of these immigrants. And that spiraling sense of insecurity was because in an enforcement environment, legal status mattered more than it ever did before. And feeling that sense of instability then went on to block the sense of integration that one might feel, again, even for someone who otherwise might be well-educated, racial majority, and otherwise have a really good job in the United States. Now, up until now, I've been telling you stories about those who have green cards, which is to say that they are those who have a path to citizenship. I want to share at least one or two stories from those who don't. And most notably, the two groups here were those who had low formal citizenship, those who were undocumented and had something, the dreamers, some of whom had the DACA status and some of whom did not. Who are notable for having low formal citizenship, but also a high substantive citizenship, a high sense of belonging, because the United States is often the only country that they've ever known. Today, I want to focus though on this category, one that you might not know as much about, or perhaps you do, because that's the category of international students, who are by far the largest category of international students at CU and at pretty much every public university in the country. And what I want to show you is that they had actually very similar stories of feeling that they were not secure in this enforcement environment. So let me just focus on this side of the slide for the sake of time. Temporary visa holders include international students, as who I mentioned earlier, have something called the F visa. It can also include an H-1B visa. That's someone who has a high-skilled, who is pursuing high-skilled work. It might be a computer programmer, an engineer, it could actually be a lawyer. And a lot of international students do eventually go on to get the H-1B, which gives them a pathway to citizenship should they choose to pursue it. But the F visa itself does not allow that pathway. And so one immigrant that I met who was an international student, we'll just say her name is May, was at CU Boulder. And she said that she came to the United States to learn. She had first come as an undergraduate at USC, and then she went on to pursue a law degree at CU Law School. And she said she came mostly to learn and only maybe to work. She said that she might be interested in getting a job that would allow her to get a green card if it ever became available. But beyond the green card, she really wasn't sure if she would be interested in US citizenship. She just said that it would depend. It would depend what the economic opportunities look like. And if it turned out that the opportunities were stronger in China, where she had come from, she would freely return to China. But if instead it was more advantageous to stay in the United States, she would do that. And so this is what I considered maybe not a strategy of defensive citizenship, but one of a transactional mindset, right? And similar in the sense that what May was describing was kind of a thin form of citizenship, one that was built less on a sense of affiliation or pride in being American, and more on a sense of it being a kind of a hollow legal status that was just a matter of practicalities and necessities. And I will say that while these stories show very similar themes, they were true not only during the period that I studied, which was roughly 2016 to 2018, but they also continue to be true. I went back to some of these populations and administered short surveys to see if anything had changed in a climate that would have included for undocumented students the rescission of DACA, for example, which the Supreme Court stopped this summer, but which is still kind of on shaky ground from the way that this government has been administering the program. And for international students, you might be aware that there's just been a rash of international student bans since last spring, including one that was eventually pulled back because there's such an outcry, but it was a ban that would have prevented international students who were coming to the United States to attend universities that had decided to provide their education mostly remotely from being able to come to the United States. Schools such as CU Denver, from what I understand. And so the theory was that these students didn't need to be in the United States if they could pursue their education remotely. And despite the fact that we're still in the midst of a pandemic, this rule was proposed to go into place. And it wasn't until the 11th hour, just before the same day as the court was going to hold a hearing about this rule in the district court in Massachusetts, that the US government decided to pull back this policy, and the coalition opposing this ban was really quite impressive. The lead plaintiffs were Harvard University and MIT, hardly the kinds of fly-by-night universities offering remote education that the rule was perhaps meant to protect students against, but it also included high-tech companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and a lot of other very powerful people who were all lobbying together on the side of the international students. There's also a proposed rule that's that's under consideration right now that would limit the F visa to a fixed period of time, a period of 4 years. which might be enough for a BA, but maybe not these days. I know in a public university, if people need to work, if they can't get the classes they need in the sequence that they need them, it's not uncommon for a degree to go beyond 4 years. And in an instant like that, under the terms of the new rule, they would have to leave without finishing their actual degree. So all of these stories are meant to show that when I studied them then and now, the limits on formal citizenship that we're seeing and the constant threat to have more limits goes on to erode substantive integration, that sense of belonging, the possibility of getting a good job, your ability to participate in American politics and civic life. So that's the story. And as I said, I call it citizenship insecurity. Regardless of legal status, up and down that citizenship spectrum, this was the experience I found, essentially that of having less than full belonging. Now, this story has only continued to be true with COVID-19. As I've mentioned to you, there have been a raft of policies of late that have only enhanced or amplified that sense of citizenship insecurity. And I think what I'll do is pause here before I go on to tell you a little bit more about those policies to see if you have any questions about the book itself. And then we can go on to look at the policies themselves. I don't see any questions in the chat. So then, do you have any others that have come in?
Thank you, Ming, for the broad overview. I was wondering if you could explain what the public charge is. I know you use some of those terms, and I don't know if a lot of people know what that means.
Sure.
And then also, I know you had a lot of advocacy by a lot of the tech companies and the Ivy League schools advocating to lessen the barriers for international students. I would love to learn more on how was it just through lawsuits that they were able to change that, or what were the ways that they were able to have the administration rescind some of those policies?
Sure. So on the first question, the public charge rule is one that the agency within the Department of Homeland Security, the agency being the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, they wanted to advance a new interpretation of a very old statute that essentially requires that for an immigrant to be allowed to come to the United States and to go on to pursue a green card and naturalization, they have to show that they have a certain amount of income security. That's to say that they will not become a ward of the state. They're trying to make sure that immigrants won't become a drain on the system. And what changed about that basic concept is the way that they were going to look for the possibility of becoming a ward of the state. And the new definition was so expansive that it would even capture individuals who had green cards and are legally entitled to healthcare and welfare and food stamps, just as a few examples. So if these green card holders were to come forward and to claim those benefits that they are qualified and legally entitled to, they would nonetheless be marked as potentially becoming ineligible for their continued path to citizenship. And this was challenged in the courts, in several different courts. There were at some point, I think, more than 7 lawsuits against the same rule. But nonetheless, it did eventually go into effect. It's been in effect for about, I'd say about 6 months. And what it has done, I mean, both since it was introduced and now that it's in effect, is a real chilling effect on immigrants being able to come forward for benefits that they need, probably all the more so during COVID-19. So some people have talked about this public charge. This public charge rule is essentially being a wealth test. And among the many different immigrants it would impact, many of those are Asian Americans, especially older Asian Americans, or older Asian immigrants are also those who might be in mixed status families. So you might have instances of, say, a parent who's an immigrant, a green card holder, who has a US citizen child, but is nonetheless afraid to go to the doctor because they're afraid that by collecting benefits for their child, that they will put the whole family at risk. So that's kind of what the public charge rule is about. And you can see how it illustrates the sense of the law seeping into a sense of economic security and social belonging.
And I bring this up because I was volunteering at an event for people to get their paperwork done for citizenship. And one of the attorneys was recommending a former student I know who wanted to go to medical school, and having the citizenship would have been helpful for him. But because the person had been on public assistance in years past because they were refugees, the attorney recommended that it doesn't apply for the citizenship. And that was really quite surprising to me, but that's when I first learned about the public charge. And I don't know if a lot of people understand, like if you've been on any kind of public assistance, that your citizenship, pursuit could be in jeopardy. Is that a correct assessment?
I mean, I think it's worrisome. I think that some people don't realize it, and then they put themselves at great risk because essentially once you file an application form with the US government, you've given them a lot of information about yourself, and so you are making yourself known to a very powerful authority that might go on to block your ability to stay in the United States. There were those on the other hand, who I felt were almost too aware of the public charge rule, which had been proposed for quite a while before it actually went into effect. And I think the worry then was that even without putting the rule into effect, it was already having its desired outcome, which was to scare communities away from collecting benefits that, again, they were legally entitled to. I see that we have a new question. I didn't know if you wanted me to take that or address your question about international students. Or
please go ahead.
A question. Okay. So briefly on the international students, I think this is one of the success stories that has come out of the last few months. But when the international student rule was introduced, I saw immediately within the first 24 hours a rallying together of universities around the international students. I know in CU Boulder, I'm part of a group of progressive faculty who just had endless emails talking about this policy and how harmful it was going to be to the university, both because of the economic impact. You might be aware that international students pay really, really high tuitions, sometimes $50,000, which is more than double an out-of-state tuition, let alone an in-state tuition. And essentially universities have come to rely on international students to help subsidize the cost of other their in-state and out-of-state citizen students. So there was this huge economic impact that would come if you were to bar these international students from coming to the United States. And we shouldn't underestimate to the intellectual talent and the cultural contributions of these international students who would be blocked as well. So a lot of that was essentially the heart of the claim for these universities. And then it was just furthered by these powerful companies that I mentioned who might be interested in hiring these international students toward the end of their stay, or potentially even to provide a visa that would allow them to stay permanently in the United States. The Colorado Attorney General filed an amicus brief. There were, I want to say in total, between the amicus brief and individual lawsuits, there were more than 20 universities around the country that participated in this lawsuit. And as I said, the first case that was going to go forward was in the District of Massachusetts because Harvard and MIT were the lead plaintiffs. And they were all set for oral argument. And perhaps in part because of this, because of the community coming together in this way, ICE decided to pull back that rule. So I think, again, tying it to the book, I think that one of the things it shows is because this sense of threat is one that is shared across the citizenship spectrum, the silver lining is that there's a possibility for solidarity. among different groups, including groups that you wouldn't usually automatically assume would be on the side of immigrants. So let me go on to the next part of the presentation and tell you a little bit more about some of these other policies. And so you can think about how what we've been talking about fits into the coming election. Now, this has way too much information on it, but I just wanted to highlight a few dates that are bold-faced. I'll start by recognizing that the US immigration policies in the late 1800s were marked by exclusion of Chinese immigrants through something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were similar laws that barred other Asian groups, Japanese Americans, at some point from coming to the United States, and also similar laws that would prevent those who were already in the United States from being able to naturalize. So there's this long history of excluding Asian immigrants as one piece of a larger puzzle of policing those who can come to the country. The 1965 Hart-Celler Act is a really significant immigration reform, especially for Asian Americans and those who are coming from Latin American countries. That is one that for the first time got rid of these national origin quotas and allowed and achieved a far greater amount of demographic diversity. I'll say my own parents came over in 1969 to go to a public university not too far from here, the University of Montana. And when they came to the United States, that was entirely because the 1965 law allowed them to do that. And the demographic transition is one that we're still living through today. The other 2 points I wanted to highlight are kind of a closing up again. So we have this opening up in 1965, not coincidentally around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and then this closing again in 1986, 1996, and then especially after 9/11 in 2001, when, as you may or may not remember, depending how old you are, for me, I was a first-year law student living in New York City. The terrorist attack on the World Trade Center towers unleashed a lot of mistrust and discrimination against South Asians. And so I highlight that as a period of turmoil, not dissimilar to the one that we're in now with the Trump administration and more recently the COVID-19 ban that has, you can see there's like 5 or 6 bullet points here since 2017 when President Trump assumed office. But there's just been a slew of policies to further exclude immigrants from coming to the United States, initially on this national security justification that is in common with 9/11, but also increasingly because of public health justifications, because within the first one of the first travel bans to be put in place during COVID-19 was not surprisingly against China, because that was the origin point of COVID-19. You might know that President Trump for a while referred to coronavirus as the China virus. And it became very clear that COVID-19 was seen as like the embodiment of a threat from Asian countries. And so that would be maybe a high watermark of some of these policies that I've talked about. So let me just dig in a little bit more. You'll remember on that pathway I showed you, there was a path to legal citizenship across the top of that chart. And that includes both the permanent path to citizenship through a green card and also these temporary visas like the international student visa. And I guess what I would want to say about these is that although you're not mostly talking about the US border as the dividing line between those who can come into the country or not, what you're talking about is what has sometimes been called the invisible wall. So instead of the physical concrete barrier, the invisible wall is largely a bureaucracy. It's a set of government procedures that have become more and more opaque, that have made it more difficult for someone to obtain a visa to migrate to the United States legally and then eventually to go on and naturalize and become a US citizen. There have, for example, been tremendous backlogs in the process to citizenship. And as Soyeon mentioned in my introduction, outside of being a professor, I sit on this advisory board for the US Commission of Civil Rights, and we decided to take up this issue for the last 2 years and to make findings based on our study about this backlog, which had grown from the statutory goal of being about 6 months from the time you file that N-400, that application that I described in the opening, to the time you get citizenship. It had grown from about 6 months to 10 to 18 months. And so, as of a year ago, immigrants who were in the queue for citizenship already knew that they wouldn't be able to naturalize in time for the election. And so that was something that was very worrisome from the perspective of the immigrants' rights, from the perspective of civil rights, and from the perspective of voting rights. So that would just be one example of the kind of roadblocks to that path to citizenship for those, again, who are legal immigrants. Again, this should be the easy case, right? These are the people who are coming in with the best of what's possible under our current immigration policies. Now, again, that backlog includes both family-based immigrants and employment-based immigrants. And just so you have a sense of perspective, the United States allows about, according to the terms of Congress, allows for about 750,000 immigrants to come based on family visas. That's the most common form of visa for the Asian immigrant community. There's also a smaller segment, about 150,000 slots that are assigned for employment-based immigration. And one of the high-level discussions among many conservatives, President Trump's administration included, has been to focus on wanting merit-based immigration. And by that, they usually mean a move away from family-based immigration, instead to focus on immigrants who have the kinds of degrees and have the kinds of jobs waiting for them that clearly contribute to the economy, both at the high end and low end, certainly high-tech workers, but also in some cases agricultural workers, and more recently there have been carve-outs for essential workers during COVID-19. So this is one example. Last spring, I believe it was initially in April of 2020, President Trump had tweeted that he was going to put a full stop on immigration to the United States. The executive order he ended up signing was a bit more limited than that, but it would, in 2 stages, end up blocking green card holders from specifically immigrant workers from being able to get a green card in the United States. And it was initially set for 60 days. It has since been extended to the end of the year. And so the first phase of that was looking at immigrants who would eventually go on to become green cards. The second phase of it that went into place about when the first ban would have expired were the temporary visa holders, including the H-1B high-skilled workers. That part was challenged in court, and as of about 2 weeks ago has been enjoined. So for the moment, those H-1B visa holders are still able to come to the United States, although there are already more proposed rules to otherwise make it more difficult for an H-1B visa holder to come to the United States, such as changing the definition of high-skilled, which ironically to exclude professions like computer programmers, who traditionally have been a very large segment and probably the quintessential high-skilled worker that is in demand in the United States. So these are some of the policies of the last 4 years. And in total, there have been 400 policies, 400 immigration actions since the Trump administration took office that have been in the direction of immigration exclusion. 49 of them have been since March of 2020, when the government started to take account of COVID-19. And as I mentioned, the justification for these have tried to build on the national security justification. For example, that H-1B, that temporary immigrant worker ban that I mentioned, the government claimed that this was allowed because the government has always had a lot of deference on the grounds of national security. And again, that Muslim travel ban was actually upheld in the US Supreme Court. And they tried to say that this was no different. But the court ended up rejecting that because they said, based on the title and the target of immigrant workers, this was no longer about national security. In fact, this was also not exactly about the public health problem. It was simply about trying to protect the US economy from foreign competition. And that was a different kind of justification and not one that deserved the same level of deference. And so that was something that the court prevented from being able to go forward. So that's the immigrant worker ban. We've actually talked a little bit already about the international student bans. And then there have been a slew of policies specifically against China, the ones I've mentioned that are directly connected to the public health threat, but also ones that protect against intellectual property, ones that guard against international students who are from mainland China, who are deemed to be affiliated with the Communist Party, and so on and so forth. It's very clear that the intersection of these policies is really this rising tension between the US and China, with COVID-19 perhaps being a vehicle or even an excuse to elevate those concerns. And this, I guess this is the final beat. You can see that the policies have been working because this is the overall amount of US immigration to the United States. And while, the discussion, the justifications of the government were a shift toward merit-based immigration, you can see that a lot of these merit-based workers have also been kept out, and that the net result has been simply to stop immigration. It's been to lower the number overall, not just to shuffle around the priorities of who gets to come into the United States. And similarly, if you break up the international student population, that is also declining, which I think shows both the kind of ambivalence that May, the woman that I interviewed from China, spoke about. People feel like they have better options. Maybe they should study in the UK, maybe they should study in Canada, instead of deciding to come to the United States where they feel that their future is so uncertain. So very quickly, I did want to highlight with the coming election what the prospects are for changes to the kinds of immigration policies that I've outlined. And I think there are a couple categories. The first category would be, if you were to have a Biden administration after November 2020, there would be a group of policies that had been initially put into place as executive orders that could be immediately rolled back. So within the first 100 days of the presidency, there could be an effort to rescind the kinds of policies that I've talked about that have started to really close up legal migration. You could start to expand and restore family-based migration and what's called humanitarian migration, a mix of asylum-based and refugee or U visa, sort of that collection of visas, all of which have been either restricted or have been sort of put in the crosshairs as possibilities for restriction during the last administration. Also, this is more pertinent to the undocumented population that I didn't talk about as much today, but you could change the enforcement strategies that have been really very aggressive and somewhat haphazard during the last 4 years. I think beyond reversals, there's also a way to think about restoration. And this could include moving beyond the immediate damage of the last 4 years to thinking about the longer trajectory of immigration. So this might be thinking about some of the holes in immigration that existed even during the Obama administration or during the George W. Bush administration. So that might be, for example, to revisit the structure of the Department of Homeland Security. Some of you might have heard that rallying cries for abolish ICE. I think that goes beyond what something like President Biden would be willing to do. But nonetheless, there are ways to consider reprioritizing the funding that goes to ICE as compared to, say, the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, the agency I mentioned before that actually administers these visas and immigration benefits as compared to being on the enforcement side of things. You might also consider farther reaching reforms, and this might be where it seems a little bit more Pollyannish, like this might seem a little more utopian, reaching for the stars. But these are some of the kinds of solutions that I do try to outline in the book, in addition to these more practical and more immediate reforms. This might be to think about, for example, healthcare for immigrants, and making that more widely available than it is now, and keeping that as a piece of the Affordable Care Act, if the Affordable Care Act is able to remain in place at all. It also might include thinking about the pathway to citizenship in this expansive way that I've talked about. Yes, literally creating a pathway for undocumented immigrants who otherwise wouldn't have a path, but also thinking about how to clear obstacles for the international students that I've talked about, and for the green card holders who have encountered these backlogs and these threats of citizenship fees. This is another victory that until last week, there had been a proposal to nearly double the cost of naturalizing from just under $700 to just under $1,200. And that was stopped again at the last moment. But those are the kinds of obstacles on the path to citizenship, even for green card holders, those who are legally entitled and just a step away from becoming US citizens. I do think there's some support for these positions. I think these are actually possible. 3/4 of Americans believe that immigration is good for the country. 2/3 believe that the level of immigration should either be kept as it is, or it should actually be increased, especially for high-skilled workers and for international students. As we've talked about, there's been a lot of support for them. There's overwhelming support for DACA and for a path to citizenship, which would require going beyond DACA to pass something like a DREAM Act that would secure their status through Congress. And while there has been some evidence in very recent polls of more skepticism of immigration during COVID-19, generally voters have expressed, especially in swing states that matter a lot, that they are wary of the kinds of anti-immigrant rhetoric that we're hearing in the current administration, and they are more supportive of the kind of pro-immigrant messages that we're instead hearing from a Biden administration. I could pause here again, or just round this out. Maybe I'll just hit a couple of the highlights and not touch on every one of these points. I think if we bring all of this home, this theory of what it's like to pursue citizenship during this enforcement era, the sense of insecurity that breeds, and also the many different examples that have only multiplied since I finished writing the book, and COVID-19 and a slew of other immigration policies have either come into effect or been proposed. How do all of those affect the Asian American community and the Asian immigrant community? Well, as you know, Asian Americans are significantly a foreign-born population. They are the immigrant community that has the highest percentage of individuals who are foreign-born, but they're also the fastest growing racial group in the United States. This makes them a growing electoral power. Although historically Asian Americans have been slower to naturalize and slower to register to vote than some other immigrant groups, the trend has been changing. And in fact, in 2016, there were 5 million Asian American naturalized voters. In the 2018 midterm election, which usually has less participation than the presidential year elections, there was an all-time record number of naturalized voters. There's also increased political solidarity among Asian Americans. Those of you who yourselves are part of an Asian American community probably know that there's incredible diversity in the Asian American community, socioeconomically, that is to say in terms of class, in terms of national origin, Southeast Asians, South Asians versus East Asians, and then within East Asians, Chinese versus Korean versus Japanese. And all of that over time has often led to fairly mixed views about politics, including about immigration. And that has always been the baseline, and it has always made it harder to mobilize as a cohesive community and to be recognized by politicians as a group worth courting and getting involved in politics. And while some of that diversity is still there, what you're starting to see is an increasing cohesion around, in particular, common issues. and then to a lesser degree, but also a rising trend around partisan party affiliation, more specifically support since President Obama was elected has moved Asian Americans in the direction of Democrats. And right now, recent polls show that there's about 2-for-1 support for President Biden in the Asian American community. I want to highlight that around issues that relate to immigration, these are percentages of different Asian American subgroups that support healthcare for all immigrants. And you can see in the different shades of blue, those who either agree strongly or somewhat that there should be expanded health insurance for all immigrants, regardless of their legal status. You see support for a pathway to citizenship, and this sometimes is surprising to people because so many more Asian immigrants come through these legal channels that I've been talking about. Not to say that there isn't DACA, but it is the case that there is this sense of, again, solidarity, partnership with other immigrants, which itself is kind of an innovation. So again, these blue stripes that go beyond the middle, showing that support for a pathway to citizenship. And last, this point about partisan affiliation, that increasing you see, although to mixed degrees, with Vietnamese Americans traditionally being the most likely to affiliate with the Republican Party, largely because of their very specific experience as refugees during the Vietnam War, and the United States providing a reprieve from the communist government that they were leaving behind. But you can see that the trends here are all toward the Democratic Party, and that this bar, which groups together Asian Americans, also shows that significant support. 47% Democrat versus 24% Republican, and then this gradually shrinking percentage of those who are not party affiliated. So I think I'll end there. I think we have still about 15 minutes for questions. I'll go ahead and leave this slide up, or I can, I'll go ahead and leave the slide up if you'd like during question and answers. I just wanted to point out that there are more resources, many of these specific to the University of Colorado. I'm the director of this CU Immigration and Citizenship Law program, and we frequently have a lot of programming. This year, it's pretty much all on Zoom, so it would also be available to you if you ever wanted to check out that website. There's an immigration clinic at the CU Law School as well, and a variety of different student groups similar to the Asian American student group that Soyeon is leading. I also just wanted to mention, this is my website if you want to hear more about the book and other events that I'm doing. I don't want to sound like a used car salesman, but if you do decide you want to buy the book, there is a 20% discount if you buy it from Stanford and put in the code pursuing20, just one word. So I'll end there. I'll go ahead and leave this slide with some additional readings if those want it, but I think this is probably the more useful.